the revisionist approach in Islamic history are those authors, those Orientalists who came around the late 1970s, and they applied the Orientalist approach to a much greater Islamic narrative of the Islamic history, meaning they would question the origins of the Quran, origin of the Islamic law, to such an extent they would say, for example, that that whole period in time never existed, meaning these characters never existed in that time. Rather, later people came in and created this fictional time in history.
That idea reminds me of something Professor Andrew Louth once said. And he said that the speed at which the eastern provinces of the Byzantine Empire succumbed to the Arabs it still remains to be explained by historians. And whenever I read that quote, I always think that, the approach that they used to study history, and the fact that they dismissed that there was any hope from God, or that these people were divinely inspired, through the prophet and through the promise of conquest. Unless they actually take that into account and how that motivated them, they won't ever be able to understand why Islam was actually able to spread so fast and, topple the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire in a matter of, a few decades.
There's, for example, Daniel Brown's rethinking modern tradition in modern Islamic thought. Okay, and there's another book which is The Authenticity of Tradition Literature by Joinbull, if I have pronounced that correctly. But for more general discussions on modern Islamic thought, you can see there's Albert Hourani's Arab Thought in the Liberal Age, and Aziz Ahmed's Islamic Modernism in India and Pakistan.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to another episode of the Islamic Podcast. Today, inshallah, we'll be talking about Orientalism and Islamic history. And we are joined by Maulana Yaqub Ahmed, who is a graduate of Jami'atul Ilm wal Huda in Blackburn. And he also completed his Masters at SOAS University in Islamic Studies, and is currently a student in the Islamic University of Medina. A very decorated profile indeed. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Sheikh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.
How are you doing, Sheikh?
Alhamdulillah. How about yourself?
Yeah, alhamdulillah. It's now even better seeing you. Okay, so let's get started, inshallah. So before we start talking about Orientalism and its place in Islamic history, can you just tell us what is Orientalism, and in terms of where did the term originate from? What does the term itself actually mean?
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salamu ala al-mab'uth rahmatil alameen. Nabiyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa azwajihi wa dhurriyyatihi ajma'in wa man tabi'ahum bi ihsan ila yawmiddin. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So, with regards to Orientalism, this term was originally coined by Edward Said. And Edward Said is a primary figure in the study of Orientalism because he had authored the very first book based on Orientalism. And this has served as a primary source for anyone who's discussing Orientalism for this study, this field. So in his term, in his understanding, Orientalism is very broad. It's a whole European colonial agenda, yeah, because he says that Orientalism is mainly a British and French cultural enterprise in India with regards to the spice trade, and the Levant, referring to the biblical lands, until the 19th century. So I guess what we are trying to focus on today here is the study of history and religion. And the definition of Orientalism can vary according to the context it comes in. So if we look at the academic definition of Orientalism, it would be anyone who teaches, writes, or researches the Orient. Yeah, and it connotes an executive attitude of European colonialism. So that would be the academic perspective of Orientalism. And the more general meaning of Orientalism would be style of thought based on ontological, epistemological distinction between the Orient and the Occident. Basically, it's a very literal understanding of what Orientalism is. Orientalism would be referring to the Orient, yeah, those lands. So that's the general understanding of Orientalism. And then we have the historical, practical definition of Orientalism, which is the Western style for dominating and restructuring and having authority over the Orient. So that's how Edward Said has understood Orientalism in terms of its definition. And with regards to his book, he says himself that the purpose of his book is how Orientalism and the network of interests brought to bear on and involved in what is said about the Orient. Also, how European culture gained its strength and identity by setting itself off against the Orient as a surrogate and underground self. And he also says Orientalism, like I mentioned, is mainly a British and French cultural enterprise in India and the Levant.
Okay, so now that we've got a bit of understanding of what Orientalism itself actually is, so the Orientalists, such as, I don't know, from the top of my head, maybe I can think of Bernard Lewis, who we have made a video on the channel about him. People like him, Orientalists such as him, what is the exact process that they use in their, I guess, study of history?
Okay. So when it comes to the study of history, what we see is what we can call the historical critical method. So as you've understood, Orientalism is a whole European colonial agenda, right? So when it comes to the study of history, we see that they approach in simple terms, their approach would be that there is no divine intervention, that God does not directly interfere with the historical events, and that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was just a man, and that there are real doubts about the historical reality of, for example, Islamic history. So the historical critical method, what is that? This method that they employ in analyzing history, in studying history, what is it? Where did it come from? This historical critical method, which we will refer to as HCM in short, it emerged from the Renaissance humanism. Renaissance literally means the rebirth. So this was actually, you can say, the rebirth of education, where Europe began to study their classical heritage, like their Roman heritage, their Greek heritage. And this was possible. This started in Italy because they were rich. They had lots of trade. They had lots of trade with the Ottomans at the time. So there was also imports of, Greek literature, etc. So this was amongst the scholarly class. There was the study of humanities, which included grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy. But this wasn't the catalyst, so to speak. It wasn't the main feature which took historians away from the traditional understanding of religion. This was actually developed further, and we see that it began with the study of language, right? It's the study of the Roman language, study of Greek, etc. And then this, you could say, entered into the field of religion. How did it enter into the field of religion? It basically, they started studying the Bible, the New Testament, for example. And then they realized that there are lots of anachronisms. Anachronism would be basically where there's inconsistency, where there's something which is out of its time, out of its place in time. So to give a fictional example, it's like saying that Jesus in the Testament is talking about mobile phones. That's like, obviously he doesn't, but what I'm trying to say here is that's what an anachronism would be. When he's talking about things, or he's using a language which did not exist in its time. So that would indicate to its false nature, because it couldn't have been possible that they were using language which came about later, or talk about events which happened later, etc. So that would actually serve as a pillar to the historical critical method. Yeah. So for Orientalists, analyzing anachronisms in a text would form a pillar in historical critical method. So here we're starting to see the critical approach to the sources of history and religion. So this built a default setting of doubt. Yeah. So they would doubt the reliability of material that was transmitted about the past. So anything that reached them, they would automatically be in doubt because of these anachronisms, etc. They would doubt these materials. Then this historical critical method was actually developed further in Germany in the 18th and 19th century. There's a famous German historian, Leopold, who says in his famous question, what really happened? So that really sums it up, how they thought. When something reached them, some material, some resources reached them regarding the history, regarding the past, the question would be, what really happened? So there's a narrative that's given to them, and that would be questioned. And then what further develops the historical critical method is the European Enlightenment. And I would say that this was the real catalyst for the study of history, the way they studied history. So this emerges from the Renaissance humanism, and this influences the historical critical method. And as Voltaire, who is famous within this Enlightenment, there's many quotes from him, but one of his quotes say that nothing can be more contrary to religion and the clergy than reason and common sense. Basically, this sums up what the Enlightenment is. Enlightenment would be the time where they would start giving preference. They would give preference to reason over God, meaning they started to see that it was nature that changed things. Although you would have deists who would basically say that God did exist, or God does exist, and he just basically set things into motion. He created the world and he set things into motion, and he doesn't have any more intervention. But that's a side point. But what we see in the Enlightenment is a move away from religion, and that's what led to the separation between the church and the state. So they really celebrated the use of reason, the use of intellect, with disregarding any divine intervention, disregarding religion, basically. So you can see how this would hugely affect the study of religious history, the study of Christian history, for example, or the study of Islamic history, which we will come on to. So, as I mentioned, anachronisms would serve as the first pillar, you could say, to the study of history. An example for this is when they studied the New Testament. A scholar named Erasmus, I believe, discovered that a verse that had been long used in the Latin Bible to prove the Trinity was actually a later addition, which was totally absent in the original Greek edition. So when you start questioning cornerstones of Western tradition, when you start questioning religion, you are basically questioning things that are fundamental to the religion, things that are fundamental to the culture in that time. So this brings further doubt. Yeah, this really brings into question much of what was received in history. So obviously, we as Muslims know the truth about the Bible, and how later authors came and basically authored the Bible, or at least what's in the New Testament. So here we're starting to see the reason for their doubt. Another principle that they would use in the historical critical method is the principle of analogy. Yeah, that's basically where they see human societies to function the same way. All human societies function the same way. So even if it was a century ago or a decade ago or thousands of years ago, the way the humans function in a society would always be the same. That's what they saw. So that would mean if we see people doing things according to their personal motivations and their agendas in this time, then they must have been doing it since 1,000 years ago. They must have been doing it since, human history. So this is very contrary to how we understand Islamically, obviously. So in Islam, for example, we have the best of generations, khairul qurun, which is the generations of the pious predecessors, the generations of the companions and the pious predecessors. So for those who are using the historical critical method, they would look at history and think that people must have naturally had personal agendas, personal motivations. So that really dictated how they saw history and how they saw historical reports. So that's the principle of analogy, and I'll probably talk about it further afterwards. And then we have the study of the Bible. Yeah, like I mentioned, there was the study of language, which eventually led to the study of the Bible, and this led to the study of the Semitic languages, which eventually led to the study of Arab Islamic tradition. But anyway, what happened whilst studying the Bible, there was the development of form criticism, okay, in Germany in the first decades of the 20th century. And this was where they combined the presumed doubt of the integrity of the text. So already they're questioning the integrity of the text. And this was combined with the modern critics' confidence that the construction of these texts was affected by worldly interests. So like we mentioned in the principle of analogy, there was personal interest involved. So this modern critic who looks at the Bible or looks at any traditional text, they would by default question it, by default have doubt regarding it. Okay, so that would be the form criticism. And lastly, the historical critical method relied hugely upon the principle of dissimilarity, which is basically if they receive a report which contradicts orthodoxy, if they receive a report which contradicts orthodoxy, what does that mean? It means they find a report that speaks against Jesus, for example, or they find a report in the Islamic tradition that speaks against the Prophet. So they would see that to be more true than those reports which support the orthodoxy, those reports which support the general narrative. So by default, they would see that if there's a report that contradicts the normal narrative, then that must be more truthful because they are challenging what's going on at that time. And a report that comes to affirm the normal narrative, the orthodoxy, then that's questionable. There's a doubt in this report because it's supporting the tradition, it's supporting the narrative, which this was actually implemented by famous Orientalists like William Maheer and Ignaz Goldziher, which we'll probably mention afterwards. So obviously I've mentioned quite a few things here, but in summary, we've mentioned one of the pillars of the historical critical method is identifying anachronisms, basically things which are out of place at time. Then we mentioned the principle of analogy, where the agendas and personal interests is same throughout history. And then we mentioned how this developed to be the form of criticism, where they would doubt the text based on this principle of analogy. And lastly, we mentioned the principle of dissimilarity, which is basically if something contradicts orthodoxy, then it's probably true. Okay, so there's a famous there's a famous Orientalist, Max Weber, who says that religions were formalized by later generations to institutionalize the charismatic founder's religious authority. Basically, what he's trying to say is that what happens is there's a charismatic person, yeah, that influences people, that influences society. So later generations, what they did was they formulated religions to preserve this, yeah, to make it institutional, to basically spread it across the earth. So that was his theory with regards to religion. So you can start to see where the flaws in this understanding is. So in summary, the basic assumption was there's an initial doubt in the authenticity and reliability of historical texts, and there's a general suspiciousness towards orthodox narratives presented in the text, and that the conviction that they had that by analyzing historical sources, a scholar can sift through reliable from the unreliable by identifying which part of the text served historical agendas. So here it's a very important part, because they have this conviction that how do you sift between the reliable and unreliable? And we'll later compare this with the scholars of Islam and scholars of Hadith. So they would sift the reliable and unreliable according to the content. If the content serves a particular historical agenda, then it must be true, it must be more reliable. And if it doesn't, that must be more unreliable. And if it contradicts, then it must be more unreliable. Yeah. So that's basically the basic assumptions that the Orientalists had when applying the historical critical method. And soon these German biblical scholars and other scholars later on would apply this methodology to the Arab Islamic tradition, as I mentioned.
I just wanted to, because I remember this when you first said this, when you started talking about the process, you said that, am I correct in saying that they sort of dismiss the idea that there is any divinity involved? Would I be correct in saying that?
Yeah, so when it came to the Enlightenment, that one of the main motives was that there was no divine intervention. And this basically eventually led to the separation of the church and state. And in the academic field, this had a huge influence in the study of history and the study of religion, because they have separated the idea that there's a God which is real, or prophets which are, actually prophets. Rather, they were just normal men. So then that would allow them to place other ideas, other doubts upon the narrative that we've received regarding religion.
That idea reminds me of something Professor Andrew Louth once said. And he said that the speed at which the eastern provinces of the Byzantine Empire succumbed to the Arabs it still remains to be explained by historians. And whenever I read that quote, I always think that, the approach that they used to study history, and the fact that they dismissed that there was any hope from God, or that these people were divinely inspired, through the prophet and through the promise of conquest, unless they actually take that into account and how that motivated them, they won't ever be able to understand why Islam was actually able to spread so fast and, topple the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire in a matter of, a few decades. People who, they used to walk barefoot in the desert, and now they toppled the Byzantine and Persian Empire, but they can't explain it because they don't accept the fact that there was help from God and that these people were divinely inspired by someone who was actually a messenger of God. So just what you were saying, they really reminded me of that quote. But moving on to question 3, the process that the Orientalists use in their study of history is that, what would be the strengths and weaknesses of that process?
Okay, so I guess before going on to the strengths and weaknesses, there's something that I have to add on, just to basically put it into perspective, that there were different stages within Western criticism of early Islamic history. So there was the Orientalist approach, for example, which we just mentioned, which is the application of the historical critical method. But then there was also the Philo-Islamic apology. It can be termed as the Philo-Islamic apology, which is basically those scholars, whether Muslims or non-Muslims alike, who came to respond to Orientalists. yeah, because they saw the flaws within the Orientalist approach. So someone like Professor Muhammad Mustafa Adami, for example, would probably regarded as a fellow Islamic apologist in responding to Orientalists. And then you had the revisionist approach. And surprisingly enough, this would actually be, it's not as popular, to so to speak, in the Western study of history and religions, but the revisionist approach in Islamic history are those authors, those Orientalists who came around the late 1970s, and they applied the Orientalist approach to a much greater Islamic narrative of the Islamic history, meaning they would question the origins of the Quran, origin of the Islamic law, to such an extent they would say, for example, that that whole period in time never existed, meaning these characters never existed in that time. Rather, later people came in and created this fictional time in history. So at least Orientalists on a normal level, they would accept the general framework, meaning the Prophet Muhammad, as in Muhammad existed, whether they agree with him being a prophet or not. But there was a man who was influential, who had influence over people. But these revisionists, for example, I believe Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, if I got the names correct, they would basically disregard this whole history. So that was a very extreme application of the historical critical method. This eventually led to the Western reevaluation, more closer to our time from the 1980s onwards. There's scholars, there's academic scholars, Western scholars, who had rejected the revisionist approach, and they still applied the historical critical method because that's become a part and parcel of the Western study of history in Western academia. But they started to recognize that the Orientalist method has some questionable approaches, yeah, and that the Muslim tradition is much more complicated than it was previously believed. Okay, so they started to realize that there were flaws within the Orientalist approach, and it is basically more complicated than it was previously understood by the previous Orientalists, which is very interesting. And I'll just mention some figures, some characters involved in this, because they are the primary figures, you'd say, who either spoke for Orientalism or spoke against Orientalism. So one of the first Western writers to question the reliability of the Hadith corpus, yeah, for example, as a source of Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu biography was William Muir, which I mentioned earlier. So he's got a book called Life of Muhammad, and he died in 1905, I believe, if I'm correct. And he basically questions the authenticity of Hadith corpus as a whole, yeah. And then the character that came afterwards, Ibn Goldzier, he applied the historical critical method at a much larger scale and with much more academic rigor. So they were, you could say, in favor of the Orientalist approach, the historical critical method. So if you want to see how they approached Orientalism, you will look at their works, for example. And there's also, for example, Joseph Schacht, who's basically followed this methodology. He actually built on Goldzier's skepticism of the Islamic history. So in response to those, we have some scholars who attempted this, for example, Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, and there's some controversy related to him as well. There's Nabia Abbott, who's an influential challenger to the Orientalist arguments as well. But like I mentioned, a vigorous rebuttal of the Orientalist scholarship came from Muhammad Mustafa Adami. Muhammad Mustafa Adami, who died in 2017 actually, he had studied in Darul Uloom Deoband and gained his master's in Azhar University in Egypt. And then he's completed his doctoral thesis in Cambridge University. And he's got two famous works. Number one, studies in early Hadith literature, And number two, on Schacht's origins. Schacht was one of the famous Orientalists. So he basically directly speaks about this in his book on Schacht's origins of Mohammedan jurisprudence. So this is where he primarily responds to their works. So if you want to really evaluate between the strengths and weaknesses of their approach, these sources will be a go-to for this. And I've mentioned regarding Patricia and Cook, where they took historical critical method to a different level, and they decided to speak totally against Islamic history, and they produced a work called Hagarism. This was authored in 1977. But it's said that they later distanced themselves from it, realizing that how flawed their approach was. And even scholars such as Fred Donner have objected to the Orientalist and revisionist claims, and they produced their own theory. And there's another scholar named Harold Motzky, who's seen to be the first Western scholar who actually saw historical reports, hadith reports, more in lens with similar to the hadith critics in the Islamic tradition. So the Muslim hadith critics, the scholars of hadith in the Islamic tradition. So he saw more in line with them. So we see a shift in some academic writers towards the traditional Islamic method. So I guess I can go into the strengths and weaknesses further when we compare between the Orientalists and the Islamic approach.
So Sheikh, obviously you talked about the strengths and weaknesses of the process and given us a lot of sources which further reading can be done upon. And I guess the next question I'm going to ask you is something that you've sort of been touching upon throughout what you have spoken about so far. But what would you say are the main reasons for their inaccurate understanding of Islamic history?
That's a really good question, because here we see that from what I've mentioned so far, and there's some things that I haven't mentioned so far as well. So, for example, their lack of acknowledgement of the oral tradition. So, within Islamic history, as you may already know, that there's a very strong oral tradition at the beginning. So when Prophet ﷺ used to say things, to make statements to the companions, then one of the main means of transmission between the companions and those who came after them, those who succeeded them, the tabi'un, etc., was through the oral tradition, meaning they would narrate to others. And generally speaking, they were all reliable. So they would narrate to one another what the Prophet ﷺ said. And there's actually instances, for example, where Umar radiallahu anhu, because he was busy during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ with work, etc., he was not able to attend all the gatherings of the Prophet ﷺ. So what he would do is he would take turns with another companion, with another Sahabi, and they would benefit off each other. So one would attend, the other one would work, and then they would swap, and then they will exchange what the Prophet had said. So we see a rich oral tradition within that time. But that's not to say that writing never existed. Yeah, writing did exist. So initially, the Prophet ﷺ told the Sahaba to basically write the Quran, and he prevented them from writing a hadith because he didn't want them to get it mixed up with the Quran. And remember, writing at that time wasn't pen and paper, and it wasn't as we have it today, digitally. It was basically on parchments and skin of animals, etc. So it was easy to mix up the material. So there was an initial prohibition, but then afterwards we see many statements of the Prophet ﷺ instructing the Sahabas to write what he says. Yeah, so the written tradition does exist. Yeah, but what we have to acknowledge here is the importance of the oral tradition. Yeah, so this is something which was pretty much absolutely disregarded by the early Orientalists, because they never trusted this and they never saw this as something valuable. Yeah, perhaps Gholzi or Shaft, one of these, they would clearly say that basically it was an oral tradition which cannot be trusted, which is not reliable. And this really totally disregards how Islamic scholars developed the whole field of critiquing oral tradition, which we'll mention afterwards. That's one of the reasons why they had inaccurate understanding of Islamic history. And number two was how they the misapplication of identifying anachronisms. Yeah. So because, as I mentioned, they studied the New Testament and they identified anachronisms, this eventually led to what they understood as anachronisms in Islamic history. So if the Prophet ﷺ were to speak of something of the future, for example, as Muslims we believe he has been given knowledge, certain knowledge of the unseen, of the future, etc. So he would have narrated those. So for example, he would have said that the Rome or Persia will be conquered, for example. So this, for an Orientalist, would be an anachronism because this eventually happened. So what must have happened is at that time, after the conquering happened, they made up a hadith to say that the Prophet had already predicted this. So this is how they applied anachronisms. And there's actually even more bizarre examples. I believe Jonathan Brown actually talks about this in his book, Hadith. It has a long title, but basically it's named Hadith. So he actually brings some examples which are really bizarre and how they apply certain principles of the historical critic method. And there's also a flawed understanding of the principle of analogy and form criticism. So to assume by default that all people are, for some reason, chasing their own personal agendas and their personal interests at all times, it's already, just as it is, it sounds, very, it's against the nature of humans. I would say it's basically against sincerity. And as we know, our whole religion was built upon sincerity and truthfulness. And we know, as the Prophet ﷺ said, that the best of generations are his generations and the ones that came after him and the ones that come after them. So we accept and acknowledge that that was a very pure time because of the presence of the Prophet and because of the proximity to the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So to then use this principle of analogy and say that because the Romans had such evil intentions and they went to war for such evil intentions, it must be that these evil intentions existed across time and history, which basically brings into question much of history. It's a very bizarre application of this principle. So that would obviously lead to inaccurate understanding of Islamic history. And also the false nature of the principle of dissimilarity. Yeah, the false nature of dissimilarity. To assume that if a report contradicts orthodoxy, it must be true, or it must be coming from some truthfulness. And if it supports the agenda at the time, the so-called agenda at the time, then you must have some doubt in its reliability. That's a very, it's a very far-fetched assumption to make, because essentially what you're saying is that no standard narrative could have existed really. No orthodoxy could have existed really. It's always the opposing theory and the opponents that have the truth, which is very surprising. So these are, in simple terms, what led to the inaccurate understanding of Islamic history for much of the Orientalists.
So just going back to, again, the first thing you said again, that they have a complete dismissal, or I guess a disregard and a distrust for oral tradition. The same thing obviously is not just seen in early Islamic history, but when using this method to study history, it's also seen when they study later periods in Islamic history, such as the Ottoman Empire. And in the Ottoman Empire, the first few centuries, especially until about, I would say, the 1500s, late 1400s, early 1500s, there's a lot of oral tradition that's used to preserve what happened, especially with like Osman Ghazi and his sons and grandchildren. And they really like, they say that they always like talk about how it's very difficult to say what happened in the early years and the rise of the Ottoman Empire, because of the fact that it was all spread through I guess oracy. And so because there's nothing in writing, they don't, because there's nothing in writing, they apply this same standard as they do for early Islamic history, that they can't trust anything, and they just, they have a complete disregard for what's actually happened. And it really limits how much they, understand Islamic history through that, the distrust for oral tradition.
Yeah.
But
what would actually add on to that is that at their time, that might have been true. Like if you were to look from a very empirical perspective, how these certain historians looked at early Islamic history, now this would actually disprove their theory, because there's many things that are coming to light in empirical evidence. So there's coins that existed from around that time. For example, there's inscriptions of the kalima on these coins. There's other different inscriptions around the world that are being discovered from that time. There's manuscripts recently, for example, the Quran that was discovered in Birmingham. After they've analyzed it, they date it back to time of Prophet, the time of the Prophet ﷺ, or just after him. So all of these are disproving their, if you were to solely rely on empirical evidences, then even that is questionable.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to something you said on question 3 about the strengths and weaknesses of the process. And you know how you said that some of them, there's a very extreme understanding that they completely dismiss the existence of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, right?
Yeah.
So just on a side note, I was quite interested in that. How do they believe that Islam then actually did come about, or the companions actually, like, what do they believe actually happened?
So as I mentioned, it was basically they would see it as later generations concocted this whole narrative, this whole story, as a fiction, basically, as in it, for them, the way they see it is that they never really existed. So later generations must have, made up this whole story for them to have basically existed, and to kind of institutionalize and spread this agenda or this story that they had. But as I mentioned, this wasn't mainstream. This was rather the revisionist claims, and this was not only was it the authors themselves, for example, Crook and Crone, they distance themselves from the work that they made with this regard, and many other academics have responded to the revisionist approach. So today, there's a huge shift in the academic field, because we see that's something that's becoming popular amongst universities, especially the university that I was studying in, the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS University in London. That was the hub of Orientalism in UK. Okay, so just like some of the teachers that I had, or at least one teacher in particular, his teacher or his teacher's teacher would be primary figures in Orientalism. So it's just recently, like, we had Orientalism in School of Oriental and African Studies, but now we've seen such a shift that we are hearing of things like decolonial studies, which eventually is leading to revision of how history had been studied. And there's also Muslim scholars that are coming onto this field. So we see those who are trained traditionally, like many of my teachers in SOAS University were Muslims who had trained traditionally. One had graduated from the Jamiatul Imam Ibn Saud University in Riyadh. One had graduated in a Nigerian traditional institute. One had graduated from Azhar University in Egypt. So these were my teachers in SOAS University. So these Muslims were traditionally trained, and they were entered the academic sphere, they have entered the academic field. So nowadays we see much work which is in support of the standard narrative, the Islamic narrative, as well as being very objective. And we also see non-Muslims, which are, very much more objective, and they don't follow the. I know I've gone on a bit of a tangent, but it's basically important to recognize how things have shifted now. Uh, like for example, Wa'il Halaq, a very famous author. He's authored many famous books. From those is one related to Orientalism as well. So he he's it's said that he's a Christian who's originally from Palestine. Some say that he's secretly accepted Islam, but Allah knows best. But his works are very respected in the Islamic studies because it's very objective, and it doesn't follow the methodology used by Orientalists in the past.
Okay, so we're gonna move on to the next question now. And in terms of their method, and I guess you have been speaking about this as well, but in terms of the method that the historical critical method uses and the one used by Muslim historians, how do the two compare, and I guess what are the strengths and weaknesses of both?
Okay, so as I mentioned right at the beginning, even that in Islam, we don't question something just by reason, okay? And it's if something is manifestly established within the tradition, just because your reason says something, you don't basically, that's not a reason of suspicion, that's not a reason of doubt. Whereas their approach, as I mentioned, is that God never existed. Prophet Muhammad was just a man. So there's this doubt that they come in with. So this tradition that they have received, there must be a doubt within it. There's some speculation within it. And as opposed to their approach, the Muslims would believe that the Prophet's time and the generations after them were the best of times. So there was no, influence of personal agenda and motivation, etc. Because it's easy for them, it's easy for Orientalists to come along and take an incident from Islamic history and to tie it with some political agenda, which may have been true at the time, but to make this as the rule. Yeah. Yes, there are rulers that came in Islamic history which weren't particularly upright, but they would use these certain instances or make up these instances and tie it with certain reason, which makes it look very convincing that there was this whole big agenda that these figures of the past were trying to push forward. And within the Islamic tradition, we know that the scholars are there to preserve the Prophet's teaching rather than make up and fabricate the Prophet's teachings. And this is well established in our Islamic tradition. Anyone who studies Islam, anyone who delves into the study of Islam, and I'll relate this a lot with hadith. I know you've been asking about Islamic history, but what a hadith essentially is a statement, a report of the Prophet ﷺ's statements, actions, affirmations, his description, and other events that were related to the Prophet ﷺ. So that is the crux of Islamic history. So when we are reading about the Prophet, we are reading a hadith about the Prophet with the statements and actions regarding the Prophet ﷺ. So that's why it's important to see how hadith scholars approach this tradition. So start from the very beginning. Within the Quran, Allah says, يا أيها الذين آمنوا إن جاءكم فاسق بنبأ فتبينوا. Yeah, and in another recitation it says فتثبتوا, I believe. So the translation of this verse is that, oh, you believe, if a disobedient person, if a sinner comes in front of you with the news, then establish it. Yeah, investigate it. So investigate it, establish, find the reliability of this statement. Yeah. So within the Quran we find the foundation of seeking truth. Okay. So if the news comes to you with regards to something, before it causes a bad effect, before it causes a bad result, find out if that event or that information is true first. Okay. So that's established in the Quran, and we know an essential part of teaching within Islam is كَفَى بِالْمَرْءِ كَذِبًا أَنْ يُحَدِّثَ بِكُلِّ مَا سَمِعَ. That it suffices for a person to narrate. It suffices for a person to become a liar, to be named a liar, or for it to be a lie if they transmit whatever they hear. So if someone says something to you and you just pass it on without affirming it, without finding out its authenticity, then you could be named a liar because of it. So if someone truly believes in Islam and they uphold the values and tradition of Islam, then an essential part and an essential ethic within the Islamic tradition is not to lie. And that's the very diametric opposite of what the Western Orientalists essentially claimed, because they were saying that it was all just lies. They were coming up with lies to build up their own agenda. So that's it is an opposition here, because how can someone who is a Muslim, who believes that lying is such a major sin, come along and make up these narratives about Islam and make up things about the Prophet? We know there's a statement of the Prophet ﷺ which is so widespread that its authenticity cannot be questioned. The hadith comes that man kadhaba alayya فليتبوأ مقعده من النار. Another report says من كذب علي متعمدا فليتبوأ مقعده من النار. This comes in Sahih Bukhari. And the previous hadith that I mentioned, كفى بالمرء كذبا أن يحدث بكل ما سمع, is reported in Sahih Muslim. So these are all authentic narrations, where the Prophet ﷺ says in this second narration that whoever lies upon me, whoever concocts a lie, whoever makes a lie upon me, then he should prepare and make his space, make his seat in the fire. So the Prophet ﷺ is warning the believers that you cannot lie upon me, you cannot make something up and say that it's attributed to me, meaning it's attributed to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So we see how important it is to preserve truthful statements within Islamic tradition, within Islamic history. So the Muslim scholars, what they did was they focused on preserving the Islamic tradition, preserving the statements of the Prophet in the best way possible. Yeah? Just like the Quran is preserved. We know through divine preservation, Allah preserves the Quran and Hadith. But who is responsible for this? Who are the cause of preserving these traditions? Those Muslims perhaps in their millions who have memorized the Quran are passing on from one to another. Even if the copies would cease to exist, we will still have people who can write down the whole Quran without mistake from memory. Okay, so that's with regards to the Quran. And with regards to Hadith, we have a whole tradition, we have a whole science. Yeah, for example, they have stipulated conditions to accept a report. When a report comes to them, they will see the chain of narrators. So, for example, if I narrated something to you and you narrated something to someone else, then that later person will come along and see this chain and see if all the people in this chain upright, are they religious, are they truthful. They will question the character, and there's whole books preserved with regards to these narrators to see if they are trustworthy or not. In Islam, as a default, we're supposed to have good assumptions of believers. So why do we have whole science, whole books in criticizing narrators? It's because of the higher objective, and the higher objective is to preserve the religion. So that's why the Muslim scholars, hadith critics will come along and judge between narrators, and there's primary resources available for this up until today. So they would judge narrators and then eventually judge the hadith. And there's this common misconception that we do not have content criticism in Islam, meaning if a report comes to us, yes, we look at the narrators and the narration and the chain of narrators, but we don't actually look at what's being said, we just accept it. But that's not true. Two of the conditions of a hadith being authentic, for it to be accepted, is one, to see if there's contradictions with other hadith. So yes, the chain might look all fine, but then if there's a contradiction with other hadith, then there's a problem. If there's hidden defects, which is a very complicated science within the hadith tradition, if there's a hidden defect, then that hadith will be questioned. And yes, essentially, it does go back to those who narrated it, because if there's a problem in the content, then this problem essentially goes back to someone who's narrated this narration, whether it's knowingly or unknowingly. So all in all, what I'm trying to say here is compare this rigorous tradition, which I think you would not find in any other religious tradition or any other tradition, in how they preserve their tradition, these statements. So we are preserving our history, we are preserving our tradition through a very, very rigorous methodology. And compare that to these assumptions that have been created through the Renaissance, through the Enlightenment, of how they study history. Yes, they are attempting to be objective, but this is led to many assumptions that are which are proven to be false. So that essentially sums up the strengths and weaknesses, the comparison between Muslim scholars and their tradition and Western academia, Orientalists to be
That
specific.
the study of hadith actually, I don't know, just you were mentioning some of the approaches and how rigorous it actually is. And I mean, you can't find that anywhere else at all. Like the fact that this study is so in depth, just about one person in a whole chain going all the way from Prophet ﷺ, and then just from one person you do so much studying, and then the next person you do the same, and the next person you do the same. It's actually like how can you come and start questioning that method and then bring in another method which is supposed to be critical, but
Yeah.
and you disregard and distrust a method which is far more critical.
Yeah.
But moving on to the next one, and we are nearing the end now. So what books and I guess lectures or articles would you recommend for people to read and watch to develop the understanding of Orientalism and the study of Islamic history?
Okay, so that's actually a good question, and there have been other scholars who have recommended books. So I would actually basically put forward what they have mentioned as well. So one of the books that have been recommended on regards to debates over hadith in the modern world, and with regards to the study of it, there's, for example, Daniel Brown's Rethinking Modern Tradition in Modern Islamic Thought. Okay, and there's another book which is The Authenticity of Tradition Literature by Joinbull, if I've pronounced that correctly. But for more general discussions on modern Islamic thought, you can see there's Albert Hourani's Arab Thought in the Liberal Age, and Aziz Ahmed's Islamic Modernism in India and Pakistan. And for more on the 18th century movements of revival and reform, you can see John Voll. He has Foundations of Renewal and Reform, Islamic Movements in the 18th and 19th centuries. You can also see Barbara Metcalfe. Barbara Metcalfe has played a vital role in the history of British India and Deoband, for example. So she has Islamic Revivalism in British India, Deoband. And there's many other works. And as I've mentioned, Professor Mustafa Al-Adhami has played a very influential role within this study of Orientalism and the origins of Islam, origins of the Quran, origins of Hadith, and responses and rebuttals to Orientalist claims and arguments. So you can definitely see his works. And as I've just mentioned right now about Jonathan Brown's works have been proven to be influential lately, and it's becoming more and more famous. So you can look at his works, for example, Misquoting Muhammad, or his work on Hadith. So these books are, essential reads, and you can also read regarding Orientalism itself in a broader nature. For example, Edward Said or Wa'il Hallaq, Restating Orientalism. I would actually recommend the works of Wa'il Hallaq as well. But obviously, we're venturing into an academic field. So personally, I would recommend some of these works for those who have some training in the Islamic tradition, so they can, channel through and read these works with a proper understanding, with a proper and background in these traditions.
So Sheikh, now that we are at the end, it's probably quite unrelated, but yeah. So as somebody who's studied in SOAS and also studying in Medina, you do have I would say a lot of experience, right? And as someone who obviously when you give me advice, it's like it's like irreplaceable advice that nobody else does ever really give. So in terms of what advice would you give to students who are studying Islam in Western universities? Because obviously it's quite difficult to, maybe go abroad and study Islam. And when you have it so close to you here at SOAS or I don't know, Oxford or something, what advice would you give to students who are studying there under non-Muslims, who would use this, I guess, process which you have been discussing? What advice would you give to them?
So I guess firstly what I would say is I think you put me on a higher pedestal than I deserve. I still have many years of training and studying to do, and I'm sure there's definitely much more qualified individuals to, give advice, even especially in this regard, like this topic, Orientalism and the study of history and things like this. It's not really my specialism, even though I have studied around it. But what I can say is that I guess it's vital to study Islam and its heritage, the intellectual heritage, through the traditional method or through traditional scholars, or at least through the traditional books. So one recognizes and acknowledges our Islamic history through the lens of Islamic scholars, to see the tradition as it was seen throughout the centuries, throughout the Islamic history by Islamic scholars. So, as I mentioned, some books, obviously, a lot of these books that I mentioned were academic related, but if a person can read Arabic, then that's a very, very good starting point, because then they can access, traditional Islamic books, which talk about all these sciences. We have such a rich tradition in Islam that it's very hard to avoid it. If you're going to be studying Islam, you've got to try to study the works that have been produced. If you go to a library, even in SOAS University, for example, you will see a whole floor, and I'm talking thousands and thousands of books related to Islam and Arabic and even Persian studies, etc. So we have a very rich tradition. So you shouldn't do away with the tradition as easily as others might. You should first study that and acknowledge it, and really appreciate the scholarly approach in Islam. And once you feel you have a proper grounding, proper understanding, then you can venture into other materials, other resources. Okay, so let's say you are already in this position. Let's say you are already studying Islam in a Western university. Then I would say, yes, obviously focus on your studies, but take out time. Maybe find a teacher who's has trained traditionally, or at least has access to traditional resources to basically understand how Islam is studied and how Islam is preserved, etc. Basically, you can look for things which are related to your studies. For example, if you're going into something more philosophical or comparative religion, for example, then you would have to, according to that, you will have to study, for example, maybe Aqidah in Islam, etc. So that's my primary advice that I would give. And obviously, you must have sincerity, and your faith itself must be strong. That if you are yourself weak in your faith, in your iman, in your practice of Islam, then I would highly advise against studying in a Western university when you don't have the proper training or the proper practice within Islam. So may Allah guide us all, I guess, and may Allah make it easy for us all and give us beneficial knowledge, that knowledge which will help us in this world and in the hereafter. And that's one of the main things that I always say to my students, is that one of the first and primary things that we have to correct is our intentions. If we are doing it for Allah, or are we doing it for our own sakes? So that's something that we must have in mind. Our intention must be correct. And to one of the best intentions that we can have after this, after making it sincerely for Allah, is to assist the religion, is to help the religion, to be in service of the religion. May Allah accept from us all.
I mean, Jazakallah khairan, Sheikh. That was, as always, excellent advice. So we are going to finish now. We've reached the end, unfortunately. So, I have actually learned so much from this discussion with you, especially because you were talking about the process that they use to study Islamic history or just any history in general. And I'm just learning because I just finished my A-levels, and because we did study Islamic history, we studied also North African history, and I'm just trying to apply all that stuff you said and just look at how they've completely dismissed a lot of the Islamic sources and Muslim sources that were used, especially in the Ottoman history and the oral tradition, especially in North Africa as well. When we were studying about the Songhai Empire and stuff, they completely dismissed the oral tradition that existed there. So, it's really interesting to put what you've said into perspective and application into what I've studied myself, and I'm sure people who are watching can do the same as well, inshallah. So, Jazakallah khairan for coming on, Sheikh. We have I have learned a lot, like I said. I'm sure everyone else has as well. So, and we do hope to see you again here on the channel soon, inshallah. And so, just for everyone else, if you have any questions, I'm sure Sheikh wouldn't mind answering. You can send it over to us on our email or Instagram. We are on a lot of platforms. So, do subscribe and stay in touch for more podcasts like this. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.